Good evening and welcome. I'm Susan Goldberg, President and CEO of GBH. Thank you for joining the State of Race, Environmental Justice. Threats caused by global warming are intensifying even as we continue to poison the air, water, and land around us. We recognize that environmental dangers are not only science issues, they're equity issues that disproportionately impact urban communities of color. Urgent and hopeful efforts are underway as policymakers, scientists, and activists are working to slow this crisis, particularly for the less advantaged among us. Thanks for participating in this timely conversation.
Good evening and welcome to this iteration of The State of Race. My name is Paris Alston, and The State of Race is a co-production between GBH World, the NAACP Boston branch, and the Boston Globe. We are partnering on The State of Race Environmental Justice live from the GBH studio here at the Boston Public Library and the Newsfeed Cafe and virtually on GBH's YouTube channel. So thank you to everyone who's here in person and who is watching. Please join the conversation by sending us your questions and comments either on cards here at the library or from home using the Q&A option on your devices. Right now, we are all witnessing the effects of climate change. I mean, it is almost 90 degrees outside here in Boston at the end of April, which is unseasonably warm. And while each of us is vulnerable to things like extreme weather, pollution, sea level rise, and increased health risk, there are those who are at a disproportionate risk and have little decision-making power and fewer resources to fix or prevent impacts to their homes and areas of work. For these communities, many in Massachusetts are demanding environmental justice, meaning the right to live in a safe, healthy, productive, and sustainable environment. Now, this map shows communities with three intersecting negatives: low income, high diversity, and low English-speaking proficiency. They are also communities who face the brunt of environmental harm with almost no defenses. For instance, the top 10 cities in Massachusetts with the highest concentrations of Black people, such as Boston, Springfield, and Worcester, have significant challenges, including air pollution caused by heavy traffic, poor disposal management, hazardous waste sites, and heat islands. So how do these problems impact our communities? In Springfield, the city held the unfortunate title of Asthma Capital of the U.S. in 2018, with 1 in 5 children being diagnosed. And in 2021, 23 deaths were directly linked to air pollution. While Governor Maura Healey has made the environment a priority with the appointment of Massachusetts' first ever climate chief, we wondered about the existing state priorities for protecting its communities. And here's what we found. Currently, 0.62% of the state's operating budget goes to solving environmental problems, which is down from 1% in the early 2000s. The Environmental League of Massachusetts says that's simply not enough to meet growing demands in the Bay State. And while higher income communities are benefiting from renewable resources like electric charging stations and solar power, those who are most in need continue to lag behind in areas such as clean air and water, solid and hazardous waste management, and green space. So let's dig into this conversation. And joining me now to do that and unpack the problems and the solutions are Dr. Lacey Satcher, who is the Assistant Professor of Sociology and Environmental Studies at Boston College, whose research examines how structural and institutional racism shapes the health and well-being of marginalized groups. Also with us is Zina Mohammed, reporter for the Boston Globe, who has written on health disparities and the intersection of human health and the climate crisis. Also with us is Sarah Armand, Director of Health Equity and Policy at Green Roots in Chelsea, an organization working to achieve environmental justice and greater quality of life through action and education. And last but not least, joining us via Zoom is Jean-Luc Purit, who is the President of the Board of Directors for the North American Indian Center of Boston. and which does international research on urban sustainability and ecological knowledge-based programming for Indigenous communities. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us this evening. So Dr. Stacher, I want to start with you as we dig into the basis and talk about what the priorities are today here in Massachusetts, because I know that you've done extensive research in the areas of diverse communities and the environment. And so what are the priorities from your perspective?
So I think one of the biggest priorities for folks in Massachusetts, and we mentioned that earlier, rising sea level, especially for the coastal cities in Massachusetts. So places like Boston, obviously Quincy and Revere, and also the potential for flooding in many Boston neighborhoods that are near our freshwater rivers. So the Lower Neponset River, the Mystic River, and the Charles River. And so there's a lot of potential for, in the coming years, a lot of flooding and possibly displacement of communities and institutions near those rivers. I think another really important issue right now in environmental justice here in Boston are urban heat islands. So places like Roxbury and Dorchester, because of a lack of tree cover and green space, are several degrees warmer than other neighborhoods in Boston. And we know the health effects of increased heat here in Boston. So that's another issue. There's several more, but I think those two are some of the most pressing issues, especially on a hot day like today.
Absolutely. And Zena, why do you think these communities that are at risk are so at risk, right? I mean, I've spoken with Dr. Stacher here on Morning Edition at GBH about whether or not those things are by mistake or if they're by design. You're shaking your head. No, tell us more about that.
Well, I think like many of the systemic issues in the city, they're by design. Historic policies of redlining, for example, have dictated which neighborhoods a lot of communities of color end up in. Neighborhoods like Dorchester and Chinatown and Roxbury that are some of the warmest parts and most vulnerable to other climate issues.
And how would you kind of describe the awareness that these communities have about the threats that are posed to them, and also their awareness about the solutions that may be available?
I can't speak to the awareness that some of these communities may have to the issues, but like anything, communities are aware of what's happening to them and they are mobilizing, as communities always will, to protect themselves. The issue is whether or not they will get the funding and support from organizations and governments and agencies to be able to do so.
And Sarah, I know that Green Roots is an example, right, of how a community has mobilized around climate and environmental justice. I mean, just as we speak, there is a community meeting taking place right now regarding lead paint chips that have been falling from the Tobin Bridge. I mean, it's 2023. We're still talking about lead paint chips, right? Tell us a little bit about not only that issue, but also just in general, how these environmental justice issues have come to the fore in Chelsea and how community residents are mobilizing around them.
Absolutely. So I'll start off with the lead. So basically the Tobin Bridge has been redone and repainted, and the parts that lead to Charlestown have all been de-leaded, but the parts that lead into Chelsea, a community of color, a low-income community, has not been de-leaded, and residents as a result have been constantly exposed to lead. And people can see that impact. People know that lead leads to a higher risk of kidney disease, not to talk about the neurological and brain impacts that it might have. So people have really been seeing this as an issue in their community. And it's actually a community member who alerted us to this fact. A union worker who had worked on the bridge before alerted Green Roots and said, hey, I'm pretty certain these are lead chips. We need to mobilize. We need to engage our community members. And so what Green Roots does is we knock doors, we engage residents, and we support people in getting access to that funding, getting access to the support that they need, while also holding our government and our people accountable. So just right now, Secretary Gina Fiandaca, the Secretary of Transportation, is at the Green Roots office engaging with residents, hearing their concerns. And we know that this is a cycle too of systemic racism. Just last year at this time, there was an asbestos dump in Chelsea by the Department of Transportation, just a few feet away from a public housing development. So we know that this is a systemic problem facing facing our communities, and we know that we need to be organizing our residents and really be advocating not only to our government, but working to engage our residents and making sure that their voices are centered.
So as I mentioned, we have Jean-Luc join us via Zoom, and Jean-Luc, you're here in spirit, and we're so happy for that. And I'm curious, from your perspective, tell us a bit about, I think sometimes it's so tempting for us to talk about all of these communities, right, in silos, even though we know that climate change affects all of us. And so much of it is coming down right to our indigenous communities, and we're talking about land and air and all of these elements that our indigenous communities were stewards of from the beginning. But how are those environmental issues turning to affect them, Jean-Luc?
Yes, from the nation state on down to the municipality, we need to have an honoring of the rights of indigenous peoples. We need to support the development of traditional ecological knowledge. NACOB, North American Indian Center of Boston, we do this through 3 pillars. One, which is developing educational programming at our community center, Massachusetts' oldest urban Indian center. We also participate within legislative advocacy, so seeking bills for siting reform and access to justice specifically for environmental justice communities. And then thirdly, also supporting the calls from our tribal governments. So National Congress of American Indians, for example, called for a moratorium on offshore wind development. So these are things that are priorities for us as Indigenous peoples, and it's important for us to support all of those calls to action.
And Jean-Luc, you mentioned there sort of changing mindset around ecological education. I'm curious, to understand where we are, we have to go back to the beginning, right? And I guess I'm curious also, how have the effects of things like colonization and globalization put us in the position that we are in now, where we're facing this climate crisis?
Well, within the past couple of weeks, we've actually seen the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery by the Vatican, and that's great. However, we have to be mindful of how that is actually being implemented, again, by the nation states and by the municipalities that have told us for centuries that what we were doing with the land was the wrong thing to do. And yet, Western science is actually coming around to the point where they're saying, oh, no, actually, the indigenous peoples had it right all along, and we should be listening to them. So our social structures need to catch up with science and actually need to catch up with the Vatican a bit.
We certainly will talk more about that in a moment, but we have a question from a member of our audience. Tracy is asking, what specific areas are facing issues of environmental collapse? Dr. Satcher, I'm going to pose this question to you.
If we're talking about Massachusetts,
yes,
which I'm guessing, yes, I would definitely say my community of Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, several different neighborhoods, Chinatown, and thinking about the word environmental, that's a really broad term. And so these communities are facing like environmental inequality from all sides in all ways. Displacement, whether it's displacements of residents in Chinatown by Tufts and its expanding reach, or whether it's a lack of green space in Roxbury, or whether it's the rising river, Lower Neponset River, near Mattapan and Dorchester. So, but definitely other communities, but East Boston and the ongoing air pollution because of the Logan Airport, just to name a few.
Yeah, I should mention my Morning Edition co-host Jeremy Siegel has done extensive reporting on those the effects from the airport. This is something we also talked about in our conversation for Morning Edition, but just about how there's a huge Latino population there, and they have mobilized around trying to push back, but also there have been some roadblocks in their way to that fight. And Zena, talk to, I guess, a little more generally about the roadblocks that can exist in these problem areas when the communities are trying to fight back. What are some of the systemic things in place that may prevent them from getting this environmental justice?
Well, civic participation and inclusion is a big one. Massachusetts currently has the lowest rates of African American voters in the country. And so when people can't participate, they can't make their voices heard, they can't advocate for the issues that affect them. And so part of equity, whether that's climate equity, education equity, what have you, can't be solved without giving people a voice in their government and what happens in their communities. Another roadblock is the fact that home ownership, we see large racial disparities in home ownership, and so you can't decide what happens in your home and in your building. You can't decide if solar panels go up, what the materials are, if you don't own it, right? And so for a lot of people that are renters, they don't have a choice in what happens in the building.
And Sarah, where does education come in when we're talking about kind of trying to overcome these roadblocks?
Absolutely. So I think there's two things, right? The first is that there are real systemic issues, like the issue of the home ownership, like climate change, that individual people can't educate their way out of. But what I think Green Roots' role in this is we have a team of community health ambassadors. They're a multi-generational, multilingual group of Chelsea residents who really look like the community that they're serving. They're all people of color who speak a second language, and these people go door to door every single day in our communities, educating people about air pollution, connecting them to the resources around pollution, such as filters and box fans and all these things. And in the summer months, we're constantly having conversations with residents about heat safety, connecting them to cooling and misting stations in our community. So really trying to bridge that divide and making sure that there are trusted messengers in our community who can go have these really challenging conversations about remaining safe in the climate crisis.
And do you find, I know I asked Zena a little bit about awareness earlier, but do you find that the residents kind of automatically know what is happening to them, or is it sort of a realization that comes to the fore when you're opening up this conversation?
I think people can definitely feel it through their lived experience. I think people recognize that when their child or their grandchild is running around on the street outside and having an asthma attack on a really hot day, they can connect to the environment, even if they don't have the right language that maybe some other people are using around it.
Gotcha. We have another audience question. Yuan from Wellesley is asking, how have issues relating to environmental justice directly affected Indigenous people? And Jean-Luc, I'm going to turn this question to you.
Yes, and also I want to basically kind of unpack the definition of Indigenous peoples, because for a lot of folks, we think about American Indians within local tribes and so forth, but NACOP being an urban Indian center, we're actually a factor of Congress actually moving to terminate its trust relationship with tribes. So you see people that are living away from tribal homelands. But then also that includes the folks from Central, South America, Canada that come here to the area in immigrant communities that are also Indigenous. And so all of these impacts that we're talking about that are disproportionate, these are much more overrepresented by Indigenous peoples. But the big factor is data equity. How does everybody actually account for themselves as Native American or Indigenous within the census, within all of these ways in which the state is actually curating data? This is the big sticking point in how we're actually pushing forward our case to have more resources for our communities to combat these disproportionate impacts.
So we're going to switch gears a bit here and talk about the health disparities that can come about when these environmental injustices are happening. So 2 weeks ago, the Environmental News Service reported the Justice Department, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts entered a $27 million agreement with the city of Holyoke to reduce overflow sewage discharges into the Connecticut River from the city's sewer collection and stormwater systems. Now, this river provides drinking water for millions and supports recreational uses as well as important fisheries. And in Worcester, low-income areas are typically littered with trash, while wealthier areas remain trash-free. Environmental justice experts say Massachusetts' constitutional rights are being denied when people can't live, quote, in a healthy and clean environment, because this is literally written into our Constitution, folks. And furthermore, Northeastern University's professor Daniel Faber stated that, quote, Massachusetts ranks top 3 in the country for locating hazardous waste next to communities of the elderly and people of color. And on top of all of that, residents of these communities are more likely to live in housing that exposes their children to the top triggers of asthma, as we've been discussing, which raises the question, what other health risks are these communities facing due to poor air, water, and toxic waste? Now, this chart identifies exposure to smoke, musty smells, mold, leaks, and roaches or rodents among those who own versus those who rent their homes. Now, how are these environmental issues impacting the health of those living in these communities? And we're going to dig right into that. Dr. Satcher, what are the dangers of releasing sewage into the Connecticut River, as we've discussed, for the communities that are around it?
That's a great question, and it really depends on what are you thinking about when you think about community, because there are impacts on humans, right? And so we know that sewage contains bacteria and fungi, parasites, and other chemicals and things that cause a lot of illnesses, right? But there's also the other side of the non-human animals in those communities. And what we know about sewage is that it contains high levels of phosphorus and nitrogen, and that is really good for algae blooms. And what we know about algae blooms is that they can completely disrupt the ecosystem in bodies of water. So you're looking at really devastating impacts, not only for humans in those communities, but also non-human animals and organisms.
And Sarah, as far as the health disparities and impacts, we've talked a little bit about asthma. Well, we talked a lot about asthma, but what are some of the other implications we may see, even maybe some of those that may be a little more silent, right, and maybe a little more slow developing?
Absolutely. So exposure to lead can really impact kidney disease or cause any neurological damage as well. Having a disposal site near a park or a playground can really impact the kids that work there. The kids that play there, and not only asthma, but other respiratory illnesses as well. So I think the other question we really have to be thinking about is why do these communities not deserve beautiful and healthy spaces in the way that their white counterparts do? Latino residents in Chelsea Latino residents in Massachusetts are 3 times more likely to live next to a disposal site or a toxic waste site than communities across the state. So it's really important to think about what is equitable, and when we're thinking about environmental justice, not to forget that justice aspect, that there needs to be a sense of equity around who's carrying the burdens across the state.
Mm-hmm. And Zina, I understand that in some of the work that you've done, you have covered on the healthiest counties in the state, with Massachusetts being one of the healthier states nationwide when we look at the conglomeration of those counties. But you also have found that health is not evenly distributed when we look from county to county. Tell us more about some of your findings.
Yeah, absolutely. The University of Wisconsin's Population Institute last month released its annual survey of the health of U.S. counties around the country. And you're right, it showed that on average, Massachusetts residents are healthier than most Americans, but that health is not evenly distributed, right? You have counties like Nantucket County that are extremely healthy, high life expectancy, low air pollution, and then counties like Hampton County, which is an extremely diverse county, which is the least healthy county in the country. And there's a roughly 6-year difference in life expectancy, for example, between residents in Nantucket County and Hampton County. You see large disparities in food insecurity across counties, but also within counties, right? In Hampton County, Asian residents, for example, live an average of 11 years longer than Black residents. And a lot of that is down to where people live and how people live and what they're exposed to.
And it's interesting because I was reading something today that was, I believe it was in some science journal, and I don't want to misquote which one it was. I'm not going to tell you which one it was, but it essentially was describing how, right, this concept of climate anxiety, right, and that can manifest itself in many ways. People report stress levels or mood changes, or maybe it's high blood pressure, et cetera. But it also made the point that a lot of times we associate climate anxiety anxiety more with white people and not as much with people of color. But we know that people of color are also dealing with all of these other issues, right, that are bringing them anxiety, like trying to pay their bills or put food on the table, or maybe they're working multiple jobs. So is that all compounded? Like, do these environmental impacts just sort of worsen all of the other things that they're dealing with, even if it may be way further in the subconscious or just kind of generally in the subconscious and not at the forefront?
Yeah, absolutely. You asked a great question earlier of are these communities aware of what's happening to them? And there's a misconception that communities of color don't care about climate change, and that's not true. They're just also busy worrying about a lot of other things, right? And these things are all intertwined. Climate change is the great exacerbator, right? So it's not creating too many new problems, but exacerbating the ones that we already have. Transportation inequity, lack of access to clean drinking water and healthy food and healthy air. So it could be that they're already worrying about these things and not thinking about them as climate, issues because they existed and predated the climate crisis in a lot of ways in some communities.
Mm-hmm. And Jean-Luc, how is this similar or different for Indigenous communities?
Well, I'm sitting here listening to the conversation, and I think that this is the perfect case for the access to justice bill that we're actually advocating for, because we're talking about a civil rights issue. Of course, when we think about civil rights movements, we think about the dichotomy of the two water fountains. And I'm also thinking about how those two water fountains didn't actually go away. Those have actually scaled up to include all of our built environments. And so we really need to think about this as not just an environmental issue, but a civil rights issue that people can actually advocate for clean water and clean air within their own communities.
And when we think about long-term health effects, what does that look like for Indigenous communities?
Certainly, I mean, we're talking about the decommissioning of the Pilgrim, the nuclear power plant off on Cape Cod around Plymouth. People that have actually seen that plant for all of their lives and now trying to stop the nuclear waste being dumped into the waters. Talking about, when we were talking about all these places, and then the Poncet River, the Connecticut River, names that have been spoken since time immemorial, and yet now we're actually seeing them being desecrated. These are sacred sites that are being desecrated. So it's a very spiritual wound for our Indigenous peoples as well as that public health impact.
We have another audience question for you, Sarah. Lena from Brookline is asking, what kind of state legislation can we endorse to prevent environmental harm?
That's a great question. Thank you. And that really follows Jean-Luc. Thank you for mentioning the Access to Justice Bill. Green Roots and NACOB actually co-convened the Environmental Justice Table, which is a coalition of environmental justice groups across the state that are working on environmental justice legislation. And so we are currently working on 3 bills. The first is the Access to Justice bill that Jean-Luc mentioned. We're also working on a siting reform bill that would require the Energy Facilities Siting Board to include public health and environmental justice concerns as part of its criteria when deciding where to put substations and electrical grids and all those things that are constantly put in communities of color and environmental justice communities. And we're also working on a bill to improve indoor and outdoor air quality, which is a huge problem across the state, especially in Springfield and other communities, but working to include mold as part of the state sanitary code and really have great guidelines for the state to follow and metrics for reducing air pollution by 2030 and 2035.
And when you think about the policies that we are seeing that are being rolled out to mitigate some of these concerns, is it the policy that we need? I mean, how on track are we or are we not in addressing these things?
That's a great question. I think there's been a lot of really great progress made at the result of community organizers and activists who've been working on this for years. I think there has to be a lot more work done. So for example, anti-displacement is a huge part of environmental justice. When these communities are improved, are we allowing our community members to stay there, or are we pushing them out with the rising rent costs? So really a lot more strict laws and policies around housing and making sure that we're allowing community members to stay in their home is really needed.
Mm-hmm. I want to give a shout out to someone I know is in the audience, Darian Johnson from the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts, who I know has personally been doing a lot of organizing and advocacy on climate policy, and especially around offshore wind. And so we have these people around who are doing these things, right? And we'll get into offshore wind in a little bit more in a minute. But I did want to shout him out because we're going to talk about that. So it all makes sense. You'll get what I'm saying in a little bit. But we also have an audience question from a member here at the Boston Public Library, who's asking how environmental racism has impacted Black and Indigenous communities. And I'm curious if this person is here or is willing to engage a little bit more with us about this, because I know we've been talking very generally about some of these things, and I'm wondering if there's something even more specific that you're wondering about. I guess I will kind of go so far as to say, I know that we have talked, heat islands is one thing that we've discussed, and to the point that we are, we're talking about, okay, we have this unusually warm day here in April. We've seen more increased heat waves in the summer in Massachusetts as a result of our changing climate. And Dr. Setcher, I know you sort of talked about how the infrastructure can exacerbate heat in these communities. Tell us a little bit more about that, specifically thinking about places like Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan.
So absolutely. So with places like Dorchester and Mattapan, there's a lot of buildings, a lot of concrete, asphalt, what we call impervious surface. And the great thing, I guess, about impervious surface is that it does a really good job of absorbing heat, but it also does a really great job of giving off heat. And so in places near the center of cities, usually older parts of cities, again, with less tree cover, less green space, which can mitigate the temperatures in neighborhoods, we see really, really hot parts of the city that are, again, 2 to 10 degrees warmer than other parts of the same city. And so when we think about heat and heat stroke and interactions between heat and medications for folks with chronic illnesses like diabetes and high blood pressure, it's really a recipe for disaster when it comes to resident health.
And is this something, Zena alluded to this earlier about it being by design, right? I mean, and when we talk about environmental racism, is that what we're talking about?
Absolutely. And I think Zena nailed it. These communities that are ultra segregated don't just, pop onto the map, right? These historically racist processes of steering and redlining have created these communities. And so that leads to, again, racially homogenous communities. And what we know about racism and racial capitalism is that there's economic value in someone's racial identity. And the way U.S. contexts are set up, and really global contexts, Black people, people of color, have less economic value. And what that means is that those communities are first in line for the bad stuff, for the environmental hazards, but also last in line for the good stuff, for environmental amenities. And that's how it happens.
And Jean-Luc, is a similar dynamic unfolding for Indigenous communities when we talk about sort of deliberate practices that have led to this environmental injustice?
Yes, and I'm just going to take y'all to my own hometown of New Orleans in southeast Louisiana. My cousins are out there along the coast, losing 95% of their land since the 1950s due to rising sea levels and coastal erosion. At the same time, my family still lives outside of New Orleans. We actually were displaced by Hurricane Katrina, but I do have family that live outside of New Orleans, next to the oil refineries and next to the historic plantations that are still in place. And you see this sort of interweaving of historical and current violence that is actually put against our people. And also, those choices of when you have to put bread on the table, do I work offshore? Do I go ahead and participate in the system that's actually causing harm for my community, but I can actually make good money doing this, and I can provide for my family now. How do we actually break through some of that thinking?
Well, I know that we have talked extensively about the problems, right? But at the same time, we have to remember that all of this is rooted in people caring about the earth that we live in, right? And so there are solutions to protect it. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that now, as well as prevention, starting with renewable energy. So 29% of Massachusetts electricity comes from renewable sources like solar, hydropower, and wind. This statistic does not compare well with the rest of the country, however. According to the Boston Globe, Massachusetts ranks 29th in total power generated from wind and solar combined, compared to other states like Texas, Iowa, Oklahoma, and Kansas, which all rank in the top 5. And according to the Energy Information Administration, solar power is the largest source of renewable energy, which accounts for almost 20% of Massachusetts power. Biomass, which includes organic waste, wood, and trash, make up 5% of Massachusetts electricity generation. Hydropower supplied the third largest amount of in-state renewable electricity and accounted for about 4% of the state's total net generation, and wind just 1%. Clearly, there is much more work to be done to tap into renewable resources, so let's discuss how to do it. And joining us for that part of the conversation is Dana Ribeiro, the Massachusetts liaison for Vineyard Wind. Dana, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So talk to us a little bit about Vineyard Wind. Like, what is it for people who don't know, and what is it expected to do for Massachusetts?
Okay, so we are building the first large-scale offshore wind farm in the U.S. So there'll be 62 turbines generating enough energy for 400,000 homes. And it's so weird hearing myself, sorry if I'm talking
You
weird.
sound great.
Okay, 400,000 homes and small businesses. So it's the equivalent of taking over 300,000 cars off the road each year. We should be up and running by this October. We're already in construction on the Cape, and it's a really exciting project, which I'm happy and thrilled to be a part of.
And so I understand that this is a private developer investment. It's expected to cost about $3.5 billion. Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, it's expected to serve 400,000 homes and presumably also bring a lot of jobs to the area.
That's the most exciting part. Well, for me, because this industry is new to the country, so there really is a level playing field. So I know with Vineyard Wind, the CEO really wants people working to reflect the community. We have a PLA signed, a project labor agreement, which requires 10% women, 20% BIPOC, and 51% local. And we're really digging in deep with that.
And so I have to ask, because the jobs are around building the offshore wind, right? So once they're built and they're there, then what? What happens to all of those people? I mean, do they get transferred into other jobs? What is the long-term impact for them?
So there's operations and maintenance, which lasts, but this is the first project. It's 800 megawatts. The Biden-Harris administration has goals of 30 gigawatts. So this is only the first of many. So when you're done with this, you go on to the next project, which is super exciting because you have a career with a great paying job for as long as you want to be in this career.
Mm-hmm. And so, and what about as far as access for the people who this is supposed to help? Who are those people? How many of them are the kind of people we're talking about who are disproportionately impacted by environmental harms? And how much money is it going to save them? At the end of the day, that's what many people are worried about, right?
So the energy goes into the grid, and then projected to save over the 20-year lifespan of the project over $3 billion. And again, this is the first project of many. So the more projects that are built, the more clean energy that's put in the grid, the lower the cost for everybody. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, I think I'm going off.
No, you're fine. Oh. No. We were talking about who would have access to this, and of course, what would it look like as far as bottom line, how it's affecting their pockets.
But then I mean, also the jobs, the careers. I mean, the office is in New Bedford. New Bedford hasn't had any new industry in a very long time. And traditionally, any industry was, people of color didn't fare well. For example, when there were factories. My grandmother worked in a factory. That's how she built, that's how she bought her house, that's how she, made her way. And I just remember growing up, like, she trained all of her managers. All of the guys that graduated from high school, all the white guys, she trained them. And one day me saying, like, Nana, why don't they just make you manager? And she was just like, that's not gonna happen for me, And it was the first time really I saw, like, how other people, how the country and the world sees my grandmother and then me, right? So this is, like I said, it's new, so there is a level playing field. We're supporting organizations like Building Pathways, which is a pre-apprenticeship program started by Marty Walsh before he was mayor, to sort of feed that hole that's being left for apprentices, because it's no longer the thing where your grandfather was a plumber and so on. So there's a hole, and so this really works to get people of color and women, and some of the people that took part of that are on our job. Mm-hmm. It's things like Be Now, Business Network for Offshore Wind, which helps train businesses to get into it and teach them the tiers. We're supporting them as they're teaching, really focusing on minority-owned businesses, which is super exciting. Mm-hmm. Career fairs that we've had two. The last one, we had contractors, 36 contractors, over 164 jobs.
Wow, that sounds very, very impactful. And I want to give. I mean, there's so much to talk about with this project, and I know Jean-Luc, considering what we were mentioning earlier about offshore wind, that there's more conversation to have there, and we'll get to that in a second. But we do have a question from a member of our audience here at the Boston Public Library, who's asking, what are the timelines and what is the urgency for many of these issues, many of these solutions, right? And Sarah, I'm going to pose this question to you and also tack on to that. What other solutions should we be considering in addition to things like offshore wind?
Absolutely. I think we really need to be considering what are the local interventions that we could be doing at the community. So for example, at Greenroots, one of the projects we're working on is called the Cool Block. So we're identifying the hottest parts of our city, and we're going in there and we're planting trees ourselves, and we are stipending community members to go and water those trees and really creating and fostering that love and care for the environment. So like, yes, these really big, large-scale solutions, and also these interventions that can be done at the community member, where we can paint the roofs of large buildings white, where we can lighten the asphalt so it's not black asphalt and it's gray, and reducing heat temperatures by a little bit, planting trees, increasing green space, and all those kind of things can be done and also benefit community members.
Beyond, it sounds cool, right? I know you mean cool box in terms of heat, but that sounds like very cool in terms of being a community member and being able to participate in your community in this way. And Jean-Luc, as I mentioned, offshore wind can be controversial, especially when we think about the impact that it can have for certain communities, including Indigenous communities. When you hear about projects like Vineyard Wind, Jean-Luc, what comes up for you?
So the big thing is that the moratorium for offshore wind coming from the National Congress of American Indians, especially Vice President Lance Gumbs of the Shinnecock Nation, speaking about how tribes have been left out of this development conversation, how there needs to be more comprehensive tribal consultation. That's the big key of it. The second thing is that folks that are listening to this broadcast from outside of Massachusetts may not be aware of how Black and how Indigenous the vineyard actually is. And so we're actually looking for those direct impacts. The jobs, yes, and transmission to the island itself. We need to have those direct impacts from the sort of systemic solution.
And Dana, I want to give you a chance to respond to that. I mean, how are you considering that as part of this conversation?
We've had robust conversations with Indigenous people on the island, but we recognize it's not enough. So we're continuing and more listening and looking for solutions that they present so that we can implement them. Absolutely.
And I also have to point out that this isn't the first offshore wind project that's attempted to come to Massachusetts, right? We know that Cape Wind was one and that it fell apart essentially.
Right.
And we also know that Vineyard Wind has been criticized for the impact that it could have on the state's fishing industry, which is huge here in Massachusetts, as well as the state's endangered right whale population, which is increasingly in danger. And there are pending lawsuits related to those things. So how is that being taken into consideration, and at what point, at each point in the development of this project, how are those things considered, and maybe taken into, in terms of taking it into consideration, maybe shifting some of the ways that this project is approached?
So with the right wheels, there are several things put in place. One, lower the speed of the boats. Also, we have protected species observers that are on the boats, and there's a work halt. So if you see something, everything stops. Also, there are these sound implements that you can put, sound walls. And it's basically bubbles around each one while you're building it, and it insulates. The ocean is everybody's, right? And we want to make sure many of the people that work there, like I'm New Bedford, third generation. I work with people that on the Cape that are from the Cape, people on the vineyard that are on the vineyard. This is our home. And the ocean is something we grew up with. So we want to protect it. And we want to make sure that we're not, in the attempt to do good, do harm. In terms of fishing, I mean, New Bedford is the largest fishing port in the world. 70% of scallops that we eat in the world get brought in from New Bedford. Prior to this, I was a city councilor. I was a chairperson of fisheries. I realized how important that is. And Vineyard Wind has worked with fishermen. We actually changed the 62 turbines, the design. They're 1 and 1 nautical mile apart. Working with fishermen to make sure, for example, if their gear is lost, that we have money in place to reimburse them, hiring certain fishermen in their fishing boats for the PSO work. We're trying to create partnerships everywhere, listen to people, and absolutely pivot when it's going to affect, when there's going to be affected is greater than what needs to happen.
So I do want to make sure we mentioned biomass so that we are integrating that into this conversation when we think about solutions as well. And Dr. Satcher, we have an audience question from Johannes, who is asking whether we should really consider biomass as a renewable resource.
So I'm on both sides of this. When we think about renewable energy and especially biomass, there's always this kind of oxymoronic situation because, again, you know, we're wanting to still have development and power our homes, our cars, our cities, but there is a cost, and it's a constant balance of just how much is enough and just how much are we damaging the environment to power, you know, human, you know, activities. So I think using biomass is a good first step, but I think there are several scientists and other environmental people with environmental ideas that are increasingly coming up with better solutions. And
Zena, I also want to ask you, because I'm thinking about, you know, Sarah mentioned the tree planting. Through this conversation, I have been thinking about how every other week or so I go to my local compost bin and compost, right? And like these are small things, but are they folded into this conversation? And what are some of the things maybe that we have to consider? Similar to both what Dr. Satcher and what Dana have said about, even when we think about solutions, maybe where some of the loopholes may be that we're not thinking about.
I think I would point us back again to the kind of intricacies of systemic issues, right? Where mobilizing on climate change in isolation is not an effective way to go about it, right? You need to think about racial justice and gender equity and all of these other considerations, right? And so when you think about climate solutions, it is renewable energy and air pollution and all these other things, but it's also transportation, right, where there's a lot of mobilization and energy around clean cars right now, right, EVs, which are better than gas cars sometimes, but the real solution is green public transportation, right? Mm-hmm. It gets cars off the road, it gives us more space to repurpose for other things, green spaces, walkways, what have you, right? Thinking about the fact that a lot of communities of color, there is segregation in what types of public transportation people take, right?
Mm-hmm. And also the access or the reliability, right?
Absolutely. Where like here in Boston, the train is generally taken by wealthier and whiter parts of the city, and communities of color are disproportionately bus riders, right? And it is better for you to be on the train, right? In addition to the fact that, you know, people who take buses spend longer on commutes, 66 hours, right, annually. You are also exposed to, you know, traffic pollution and other things, right? Or another intersection that I think there is an opportunity to introduce is prisoner rights, right? Prisoners are extremely vulnerable to climate change because they're not in control of where they are, right? And so thinking about flooding and who gets evacuated and if they get evacuated, right? Last year in Florida, we saw a lot of flooding, and in a lot of the counties, prisoners weren't evacuated because they're at the mercy of what local government decides to do, right? And so I think like introducing intersectional thinking in climate justice is the only way to go about it. And so I encourage people to think about like all of the other things that they see in everyday life that might not obviously be a climate issue, but might be some type of issue, because there's always a climate tie-in.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
I don't know if that answered your question.
It did, 100%. Well, I mean, I think it gets to this point of, you know, when we talk about these things that have been intentionally done, and even in the lack of policy, I mean, we're seeing changes, right? But at the lack of policy that we've seen thus far to try to mitigate these harms, then it becomes about the communities helping themselves, which I know, like, then it's like, but this is a problem that they haven't created, and now they have to fix it themselves. So there is that tension there. And Jean-Luc, for Indigenous communities, I'm also curious about how they are finding their own solutions.
Yes, because the thing is that first and foremost, we cannot live the way that we've been living this whole time. We're talking about like even just keeping up with cars and everything, those EV cars and those lithium batteries, thinking about like how the lithium is actually extracted from indigenous lands within South America, Bolivia, and so forth. So, you know, we definitely have to kind of think about like, this is why I kind of appreciate this conversation, that we're having this very intersectional conversation. We're actually kind of like crossing like all of these different things, all of these different lines. And this is the mindset that we have in terms of our ways of knowing, our traditional ecological knowledge, that how I treat the earth is relative to how I treat my mother, my grandmother, and so forth. So we really have to have a different mindset and a different lifestyle to be able to go forward. We can't just have adaptive technologies to continue the lifestyle that we've been having.
And Jean-Luc, I mean, I wonder if you can also give us a sort of a peek into, we talked earlier, right, about ecological philosophy. What are some of the principles from Indigenous communities that we can learn, that we can begin to adopt, maybe moving away a little bit from what we've seen that has come out of industrialization and globalization and colonization?
Yeah, I think that, you know, well, for one, we can only speak for our own nation. But also, you know, when we think about like sort of the calls to action that have come into sort of like the mainstream consciousness in terms of water is life, land back. These are things, these are principles that are, yes, these are environmental justice calls to action, but these are things that are actually kind of based upon the people actually voicing what the philosophy is. Because, you know, at the end of the day, it's not necessarily that this is our land, this is our political territory. Rather, we are of the land, and we need to get back to being who we were as people of the land and of the waters.
So I'm going to open this up sort of to everyone, but I'll start here with you, Dana. When you hear something like that, and when you think about the role that corporations play. I mean, we have a question from a member of the audience who's essentially asking what corporate law actions can lead to, or considering that corporate law actions or corporate actions lead to the biggest change. What can businesses be doing to make sure that they're being good stewards of the land and the air around us?
I think listening, first and foremost, meeting with Jean-Luc and other tribal members and really listening and then implementing based on what they say. I know with Vineyard Wind, listening is the most important thing, not only with that issue, but with others.
And I'm inviting anyone else to chime in on that, but also just sort of to generally give your closing thoughts about where we go from here. And Sarah, go ahead.
Totally, I can start. So I think it's really important to think about environmental justice as being the process and not just the outcome. Environmental justice isn't just the outcome, it's about how people are engaged, how they can participate in making decisions about their environment despite financial barriers, despite language barriers. So really making sure that there's always community participation, or we're centering the experience and identities of those who are most marginalized.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Satcher?
Absolutely, and just to add to that, I think it's also really important to think about having culturally, socioeconomically, and racial and ethnically diverse representation on these boards of organizations and governments that are making decisions that are impacting communities, whether it be siting of a landfill or, de-leading a bridge. Having more diversity and representation is really important.
Mm-hmm. And Zena, I'm going to tack on to your closing thoughts. I'm going to give you a little bit extra work to do here, but also just in addition to that, tell us what's the role of media in setting the tone for how we have these conversations and how we put the pressure on to hold people accountable and to reverse the harms.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, on the issue of inclusion and representation, it's important to make sure that our media is representative of the people that we're speaking for and informing, right? There are issues that might be obvious to certain people based on their lived experience, and so getting a breadth of lived experience in the newsroom is a really important part of equitable coverage and coverage that is actionable for communities, right? And I'm blessed enough to work in a newsroom where I see myself represented, and nowhere is perfect and there's a lot of work to be done at the industry level, but I do feel that there's a sense of urgency from a lot of news organizations right now to do what they can to diversify and make sure we're inclusive. But part of that is also about funding media, right? Which is not so much on the everyday person as it is on the powers that be. But Massachusetts again is very lucky to have Boston, I should say, is lucky enough to have a pretty healthy news organ, but there are huge news deserts across the country, and they're only growing, and they will often fall on the communities that are hardest hit for, the reasons that we've been talking about, right? It's a symptom of an under-resourced community when your local paper shuts down or when there's 2 people covering a city, right? And so I think reporters need to make sure that we're doing what we can to cover the issues that matter most to people. And, we, as an industry, also need a lot of support right now from the corporations that are buying and shuttering a lot of local organizations around the country, or local news outlets around the country.
So I think we can agree on a shameless plug for everyone to support their local journalists and local journalism, right? Your public media station, maybe, your local newspaper. And Jean-Luc, lastly, your closing thoughts.
Yes, NACOB participates in a coalition called the Black Mass Coalition and the Black and Indigenous Resistance Fund. We have a blueprint for the new world, which has targets for public and private sectors. The crux of it being that how can we actually set goals for both of these sectors to divest from the systems that are doing harm to our communities, such as fossil fuels, such as mass incarceration, and directly invest in the folks that are on the front lines calling for change. So that's what we need. Divest from harm and reinvest in the communities.
Well, I want to say a huge thank you to Jean-Luc and each of our panelists for just having a really amazing, thorough, and wide-ranging conversation tonight as we have explored environmental justice here in Massachusetts. We also want to give our appreciation to our partners at the NAACP Boston branch, as well as the Boston Globe. And we want to thank you for joining us here at the Boston Public Library and online. Give yourselves a round of applause for being just at least an ounce smarter as a result of tuning into this conversation, and we promise to get to every question online and in person. You can find out more information by visiting our State of Race page on gbh.org, and until next time, take great care.
Welcome to America, where our babies are having babies, locked up and mistreated, babies taking care of babies.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elijah Farron from GBH's local marketing department. We're glad you can join us during tonight's discussion. Important programs like the State of Race are made possible by GBH members, people like you who support GBH and World Channel's commitment to respond to, represent, and include the diversity of our community in the work we create and how we do that work. Your support helps World Channel to continue to showcase multicultural filmmakers and storytellers who are reporting from the heart of their communities. Help us raise visibility and further conversations around issues racial and ethnic communities face, like tonight's The State of Race discussion. Tonight, if you're able to give $5 a month as a sustaining member, that's just $60 a year. We'll then send you this GBH Gray logo shirt to show our appreciation. Tonight, there are 3 ways to give. Visit wgbh.org/support events, text GBH to 800-204-3811 using keyword GBH to donate, or you can scan the QR code here to open the donation form on your screen of your smartphone. There will never be a better time to give. Donate to GBH today because every dollar counts. By supporting GBH today, you are letting us know what matters to you. Out of all the news and information sources available, you turn to GBH. That's why we're turning to you to ask for your support. Your support is vital to the GBH mission of offering insightful, objective, and necessary information to serve our audiences. Please consider becoming a member today. And if you're already a GBH member, thank you. Thanks again for joining us this evening. Have a good night.